This episode is part of the pool's Local Officials Stronger Together podcast series. It's one way we serve local officials through integrity, public service, fiscal responsibility, and operational excellence. As always, please direct specific questions about coverage to your risk management advisor.
Welcome to the Local Officials Stronger Together podcast series. I'm your host, Scott Houston. Today, we'll be talking about what elected officials and managers need to know about first responder mental health. I'll be talking to Rick Randall. Rick teaches 2 classes for the pool about this subject. I've linked below the podcast to the pool's training calendar where you can look for these classes: Resilience Strategies for First Responders and Moving Right of Bang, Critical Incident Early Intervention Strategies. In this 15-minute podcast, though, we'll get an abbreviated version from Rick of what you'll hear in the classes, which are available at no cost to city officials and first responders and their family members as well. Then, as always, we'll do some action items to help you get everything you can from our partnership. All right, welcome back. I'm here with Rick Randall. Hey, Rick.
Hey, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, tell me a little bit about your background, Rick. How did first responder mental health become such a passion for you?
Interestingly enough, I was a senior chaplain with the Austin Police Department for 23 years. And in that role, I was dealing with a lot of the officers and their families when they would go through crises. And I began to see patterns of behavior. Almost you could predict what the outcome was going to be after a while. And the patterns were so widespread that I began to suspect it wasn't just an individual's choice, but that there were some systemic issues at play. And that caused me to go and do the research. And the deeper I dug, the more I found what those systemic issues were. The goal has been to now take that and turn it into something proactive, where before the damage gets done, we can help people put the right kind of structures in place so that they'll thrive in their career instead of being a victim of it.
Well, that's awesome. Here at the Risk Pool, we obviously use you all the time to do our resilience strategies for first responders that are specifically classes for first responders themselves and their families. This podcast is really directed more at elected officials and city managers and city attorneys. So tell me what those folks need to know about the first responders who work for them, about those first responders' mental health. Tell me about the facts of life that you call it that first responders live with every day. Let's kind of start with the emotional hazards that you've talked about.
Yeah, we often say, those of us in leadership or management will often say our most valuable resource is our people. So let's talk about that resource. First responders are 2 times more likely to abuse alcohol than the general population. They're number 1 of all professions for heart disease, hypertension, and diabetes. They have a divorce rate that's nearly twice the national average. They have a suicide rate that's 1.9 times the national average. They have a life expectancy that's 22 years less than the general population. And those statistics are pernicious. They exist across generations. For about 75 years, that's been true. So when you've got a system and you put in the kind of raw material that we put in, so at the beginning of their career, we're starting with people that, generally speaking, are mentally sound, physically in pretty good condition, and passionate about doing their work. And yet you look at the end of their career and you're seeing those kind of statistical outcomes. It suggests that things need to be put in place by leadership to help mitigate those damages. And it is possible to do that, but it requires intentionality on the part of municipalities and police departments, fire departments, emergency services, even communications workers. suffer the same kinds of issues.
Well, those are certainly some compelling statistics. And I think that they're things that those of us, even maybe in city management, aren't something that we can really relate to. We don't deal with those types of things in our daily life as a typical matter. So tell me a little bit more about some of the physical hazards and the spiritual hazards even that our first responders are dealing with.
The main things that we see are burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, post-traumatic stress, and then there's a thing called moral injury. And burnout's very common among first responders. You're in a position where you're having to react compassionately to people's worst moments, and you're seeing suffering that's kind of unimaginable. I don't know that the average city official really has a picture for what these folks are having to see on almost every call that they take. And over time, that just has a corrosive effect where people burn out the very job that they were passionate about doing originally. They no longer have any fire in their belly for, or they can't sleep, or they're using alcohol to get rid of the images in their mind of the traumatic things that they've seen, or they could actually develop post-traumatic stress injury. And then moral injury is what happens when you see human suffering, or you see violation of your code of right and wrong, and you see that over and over and over again, and eventually it can cause your moral compass to start to waver. And for cities, what that means is you have increased problematic interactions between first responders and the public. You may have increased investigation because people are violating policy or using force inappropriately. So all of these things together create probably what most city officials would say is the headache of leading public safety agencies. But there are causes behind those issues that can be addressed.
So you talked about burnout and compassion fatigue, and you talked about PTSD. There was something that you mentioned at a session you presented at the TML annual conference, and you called it general adaptive syndrome. Can you tell me a little bit about that and sort of the stages of how that happens?
Yeah, that general adaptational syndrome refers to the stress response when we are under stress, and it's also known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. Whenever we encounter a stressor, and that stressor could be somebody pointing a gun at us, or it could be somebody threatening our livelihood, threatening our job. It could be a supervisor that's said we're going to have a disciplinary case. The body's reaction to those, any of those, is identically the same. It doesn't discriminate between a physical threat and an emotional threat, and it only has one response, which is very primitive. That response creates a lot of the collateral issues that we talked about in that little statistics piece, because your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your digestive system diverts the blood away from the digestive organs into the large muscle groups. That causes acid reflux. The cortisol that's flowing through your bloodstream because you're under stress creates problems with sleep and can contribute to pre-diabetic conditions. That increased heart rate and increased blood pressure can cause a permanent high blood pressure and hardening of the arteries, setting you up for coronary heart disease. So that general adaptation syndrome is the root cause of most of those physiological issues that we talked about in that session.
Well, this is all very compelling information, and what we're obviously going to try to do is encourage folks to attend either classes that you teach or other classes or systems that they can use to deal with all these issues. Now, the podcast, like I mentioned earlier, is mostly for elected officials and management. So what I'd like to do and I try to do this at the end of each podcast, is I like to give action items that a city manager or a mayor can take back and actually do something to implement processes and procedures that can help avoid these problems in their first responders. Ways to help, in other words. Let's do that when we come back. Okay, let's do a couple of action items now. One of the things you've talked about, Rick, is mental resilience. What can a city do to help its first responders with that?
That's a great question. So even, first of all, just to be aware that resiliency needs to be part of the culture of their department, their emergency services. It's long been known that the standard in the industry is if you've got an emotional injury or you've got any of these things we've been talking about, you just suck it up and you keep working. And we know that doesn't work. So having a system where people are not penalized for saying, that was a really tough call. I need to take a couple of days to get my head screwed on straight, or I need to go for some help because I'm finding that I've got a short fuse and I'm taking it out on my family. To be able to do that, have an environment where you can do that with complete confidentiality, you can get the help that you need. It's not going to impact your career. To have policies in place that specifically say that's huge. And that's something that the officer or the firefighter or the lieutenant or the captain, they can't do that. The city has to do that, has to have those policies. That would be a great starting place. Then I would add, actually train in resiliency when people are starting their careers. The resiliency tools need to be on their professional tool belt, just like their handcuffs, their gun, their flashlight, their bunker gear, their medical tools. They have to have it there and know how to use it and when to use it and be encouraged to use it regularly, because there are things you can do in real time, like debriefings, et cetera, that actually will minimize the trauma emotionally and physically of these events. The last thing I would say is we have a class called Moving Right of Bang, and it's Critical Incident Early Intervention Strategies. We offer that regularly around the state. That class is best. The best results come from that class when it's attended by city officials, the people who actually have the power to make decisions to handle things differently in their departments.
Okay, well, I'm certainly going to push out the information about that underneath the podcast. For action item 2, let's talk about some specific tools cities need to give their first responders.
Peer support is probably the best tool in the toolbox, and it's a fairly inexpensive program. It's not hard to get the training, but to recruit volunteers in these various agencies who will become trained and be able to be ears on the ground to know when people are starting to experience traumatic outcomes, and to be able to intervene and have some resources at their command where they can help plug the person in. The fact is, we will all talk to somebody who's on our same level or who we have commonality with in our work. We'll talk to them a lot more readily than we will to a mental health professional or to a supervisor, for example. So peer support teams are vital. Chaplain programs, I think, are vital because there's an expectation of confidentiality when you speak with a chaplain. And oftentimes, chaplains have access to resources in the community that departments may not be aware of. And then the third thing is having ready access to mental health professionals when you need more skilled or sophisticated care or treatment. Those are three things: peer support, chaplains, and mental health professionals that would do a lot at changing those outcomes.
Well, that's awesome, Rick. I'm so glad that we have you on our team at the Risk Pool. I'm so glad that you've shared just little snippets today on the podcast about some of the amazing things that you and others are doing. With your permission, I'm going to put your email address underneath the podcast, so anybody, whether it's an elected official or a manager or a first responder, can reach out to you if they need direction. Rick, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I can't thank you enough for what you're doing for our cities and our first responders. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
It was great talking to you, Scott, and I welcome any city official who wants to reach out and get more information on this.
Outstanding. Okay, that's it. Thanks for being our partner, and be sure to tune in to another episode soon.
To review written materials associated with the presentation or to ask Scott a question, please visit www.tmlirp.org and click on the Stronger Together podcast link. Please remember that the information in this episode is provided for informational purposes only and doesn't constitute legal advice. We recommend that you review the podcast and the accompanying written materials with your attorney prior to taking action.